Okay, this week we're going to talk about 3 photography mistakes that could really happen to anyone. And this was inspired by realizing the same pattern of errors that I would make. Now, this is something that's been happening over years, and I've learned to correct them, I've learned to prevent them, but we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about how you can avoid them going forward and how you can just have them in your head, and that can really help inform the kinds of shots that you take. Let's get into it. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new fresh photography tutorial. This week, like I say, we're going to talk about 3 kind of classic photography mistakes, and these are all mistakes that, believe me, I have made more than I should have done. Way more than I should have done, including in situations where it really wasn't ideal to be making these kinds of mistakes. I'm talking shooting events. You can't reshoot those. Oh, not fun. Okay, let's just crack straight into it, because these are all things that are kind of close to my heart and I think are really important. And I've just been going through some old photos recently and I've been really thinking about it. That's why we're going to talk about it this week. So let's talk about mistake number 1. Now, this is one of the biggest ones that took me the longest time to really get my head around actually fixing. And that is shooting with too shallow of a depth of field. And there's lots of reasons this happens, lots of ways that this can happen, and it can really ruin a photo. Now, this isn't exclusive to portraits. This has happened to me with food photography. This has happened to me with product photography. Absolutely has happened with portraits, but even in shots that I've taken for this YouTube channel, including shots for thumbnails, product shots, I just shouldn't have had such a shallow depth of field. And there's lots of reasons that this happens. So the most obvious one is going to be shooting wide open when that's not necessarily the best way to do things. I shoot a lot with my 24-70 f2.8, and for the majority of shots, I will tend to leave it at f2.8 because, you know, I've bought an f2.8 lens, I'm going to use f2.8, but that's not always the best aperture to be using. And just shooting wide open because it's available, especially if it's a prime lens, you know, f1.8, 1.4, 1.2, it doesn't mean it's the best aperture for the job. And that takes quite a long time to get your head around. Actually, sometimes stopping down to f4, f5.6, f8, can be the better aperture to be using depending on what you want to go for. And it's just best, I've found, to slow yourself down and think about what you want out of that shot. How much of the image is supposed to be in focus? You know, if it's a portrait, do you just want those eyes in focus and it to start falling off front and back? Or do you want more of your subject in focus? Same with product photography, where you probably want more of the product in focus. Food photography, same kind of thing. We all have a blurred background, but there's a limit, right? You want that background to be blurred, not necessarily part of the subject that you're actually photographing. Now, another thing that can really affect this is actually getting too close to your subject. This is something I never used to think about when it came to my depth of field, but getting closer into your subject will massively affect how shallow your depth of field can become. And that can cause you a massive issue when it comes to actually the final image. You then stop down, as I have done, f4, f5.6, and I think, great, I'm fixing the issue, but actually now you're just much closer. You still have a very shallow depth of field and it's not working. And again, that can be amplified by actually zooming in. So for example, for me, using a 24-70, I love shooting 50mm, 70mm. And actually, again, that can cause you to have a bit more lens compression. You then end up combining that with moving around your subject a little bit, and you can end up with this very shallow depth of field. It's just problematic. Even shooting at f5.6, for example, still end up with shots that are just not quite right. Something like this, where yes, the camera is in focus, but the part that kind of comes up, the microphone area, the actual audio inputs of the camera, this is an actual product shot I did for this YouTube channel. That part is out of focus, and that's not ideal. In this case, the camera went back to Sony. I can't redo that. So that's the shot we have. And actually, it is just as simple as thinking about all 3 of those parts of taking the photo: the aperture that you're shooting at, the distance from your subject, and even the actual focal length that you're using. All 3 of those will play a role in what the depth of field looks like and what the overall image looks like. And it's just really important to keep all of that in mind when you're taking the shot, whether it is a portrait or product photography or food photography or really anything else at all. Having the right focus and the right depth of field is so important. Now, mistake number 2 is one that haunts me every day. This is cropping in too tight. And this is something that I do all the time. I love going in tight. I just mentioned I love shooting zoomed in 50mm, 70mm. I love an 85mm lens. But for me, for some reason, I always just go a little bit too close to my subject. I always like to fill the frame, right? But I don't leave enough of a gap for any room for error at all. This is something I'm having to learn, and I'm still fighting this every day. Every time I go to take photos, I have to think about it, which is just to back up a little bit, just zoom out a touch, go a little bit wider. I can always crop in, right? I've got a little bit of room for error, whereas I always just go in so tight. And the worst part about that is if you're shooting people, if you're shooting an event, is cropping people, right at the wrist or at the knee, basically at a joint. It just looks very uncomfortable in the composition. It just doesn't work well. It's just no good. I am permanently haunted by the reminder of shooting someone's first communion and actually cropping the child in question's legs out of the frame, the main portrait, the family portrait. We'll never get over it. I'll never, ever get over it. They've never mentioned it. But I know, never again. This is a big one for me, just learning to shoot just a touch wider, just leave a little bit more room in the frame. Now, a big part of this, again, is slowing down, really thinking about that end shot, really going for that end result. And actually, if it's not an event where I'm just capturing the moment, then I will tend to shoot a couple of different photos, right? Maybe a tighter one, and then a little bit wider, and then probably a little bit wider again, just to give myself a few options when I get back to the computer. I love the tighter feel. I love the tighter look. I love getting in close to my subject like that. But having those different options means that when I come to edit, if I do think, okay, I've gone a bit too tight there, I have the slightly wider shot and then the slightly wider again to play with. This ties in really nicely with the shallow depth of field part of things as well, which these go hand in hand, getting in too tight and then the depth of field is too shallow and it's just a nightmare. So thinking about your shots, slowing down a little bit and really just considering that composition is just the biggest part of it. In fact, I'd say that thinking about your composition is the thing that will fix most mistakes in pretty much any image that you take. And that brings me on to tip number 3. I want to talk about not considering the subject for long enough. So a classic one for me is having a beautiful view, there's a beautiful landscape, but not identifying what the subject is in the landscape. It's such a big thing for me, and it's just such an important part of just all photography, really. This is something that identifies where the viewer's eye should be naturally resting. This is kind of giving the whole purpose of the composition. Then you can think about leading lines, you can think about how you want to build and compose this photo, what's the story of it. And this is true for things like landscape, obviously for portrait, this is true for street photography, this is true for food photography, this is true for photography. Identifying the subject, understanding the subject, and then photographing the subject. You can build your composition around that. Think about everything around that subject. And for me, the way to do this and to fix those other two problems is to slow down. If I slow down, I can start to think more about what is the actual photo saying? What is the story? What is the message? What is the viewer supposed to be feeling or thinking or even looking at when they view this image? That will inform pretty much everything else. And that can help fix all of these mistakes. Now, those are the 3 mistakes that I think have been the biggest contributors to any nightmare I've had with photography. I think those are the biggest 3 for me, but I'd love to hear any other mistakes that you think have been big for you. Anything else that really stands out as something maybe you've struggled with in the past, something you still have to think about every time you go and take photos, because I know I still think about all 3 of these every time I'm taking photos. I love to hear that kind of stuff because we can all learn from each other, and it's such a great opportunity to just become better at the craft we love. Of course, you can check out a full list of all the kit we use for these videos, for all the photos as well, down in the description below. I'll pop links down there so you can see all of that stuff, all the fun stuff. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. We've got some great stuff coming up, tutorials, reviews, loads of stuff all the time. It's a constant party and you're invited. I'll see you next time, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.